There is a city in Scotland where you can stand in one spot and see, at the same time, a fortress that has been occupied for nearly 2,000 years and a parliament building that opened in 1999. Few cities on earth compress that much contradiction into a single sightline. Edinburgh is not a city that preserved its past. It is a city that could never escape it. Every attempt to modernize ran into stone that refused to move. Every attempt to hold on ran into forces that refused to stop. The result is a place that looks like it was designed by history itself. Layer by layer, argument by argument, century by century. This is the entire story. From the first hunters who crossed a frozen landscape 10,000 years ago, to the debates happening in that new Parliament building right now. 13 chapters, 10,000 years, one city that should not exist, and yet somehow always has. Chapter 1. The Rock Before the City. The ice retreated, and people arrived almost immediately. That fact alone is worth pausing on. The great glaciers that had buried northern Britain under thousands of feet of ice for tens of thousands of years began their final retreat roughly 10,000 years ago, within a few generations, perhaps faster. Small groups of Mesolithic hunters were already moving through the raw new landscape left behind. Not cautiously, not tentatively. They followed the animals that followed the vegetation that followed the ice northward. And they came quickly. Archaeologists working at Cromwell, on the western edge of what is now Edinburgh, have recovered stone tools and organic material dating to around 8,500 BC. What this means is that people were present in the Edinburgh area within a few centuries of the ground becoming walkable after millennia of ice. The impulse to explore newly opened land, to follow game into territory no human had ever seen, is apparently one of the most powerful drives our species possesses. The ice left. People came. The landscape they entered was nothing like Scotland today. Birch forests, spreading across ground that had never seen a tree. Rivers running full and violent from glacial melt. Enormous herds of red deer moving through valleys that had no human sound in them at all. And rising from the flat land of the Lothian plain, visible from miles in every direction, a massive plug of dark volcanic rock. That rock is still there. You know it today as Castle Rock, the foundation on which Edinburgh Castle sits. In 8,500 BC, it had no name, no castle, no city around its base. It had only the hunters who stopped near it, made fires, cracked open animal bones for the marrow inside, and understood immediately what it was. The rock rose sharply on three sides, nearly unclimbable without equipment. From its top, you could see threats approaching from every direction across the flat plain below. Anyone holding that summit held a position that attackers could not reach without enormous difficulty and enormous casualties. In a world without fortifications, without walls or towers, or any of the technologies that later civilizations would develop for defense, a natural feature like that volcanic plug was the equivalent of a fortress handed to you by geology itself. They did not build on it yet. The Mesolithic hunters were mobile. Following animals and seasons across a landscape, they read with a precision that modern humans have almost entirely lost. But they came back to the Edinburgh area. The archaeological record at Cromwell and at other sites around what is now Edinburgh shows repeated human presence across the Mesolithic period. This was not a place people passed through once. It was a place they returned to. Thousands of years passed. The climate shifted and warmed. The birch forests gave way to denser woodland. Mesolithic hunters were followed by Neolithic farmers who cleared land, grew grain, and began to think about landscape in a fundamentally different way, not as something to move through, but as something to possess and work. Then came the people who learned to work bronze. Then, iron. By roughly 600 BC, the volcanic rock was almost certainly the site of a hill fort. The Iron Age people who built it belonged to a broader culture spreading across northern Europe, skilled in metalwork, experienced in organized violence, and entirely clear about the military value of a rock that was impossible to climb from three sides. They built their houses on top of it. They stored grain there. They drove their animals up in times of danger. They had taken what the Mesolithic hunters had recognized and made it permanent. These people were part of the territory controlled by a tribe the Romans later recorded as the Votadini, who occupied a large stretch of what is now southeastern Scotland and northeastern England. They were not a simple society. Archaeological evidence shows long-distance trade connections, sophisticated agricultural systems, and a social hierarchy complex enough to produce specialist craftsmen, warriors, and administrators. Then, in 43 AD, something happened far to the south that would send consequences rippling all the way to this rock. Rome invaded Britain. The legions of Emperor Claudius landed on the southern coast and pushed inland with systematic efficiency. Within a generation, they controlled most of what is now England and Wales. But Scotland was different. The terrain became harder. The resistance became more determined. Supply lines stretched thinner with every mile north. The Romans pushed north twice in earnest. First, with Hadrian's Wall in 122 AD. Then with the Antonine Wall, a turf barrier built further north, completed around 142 AD. That second wall ran across the central belt of Scotland, just to the west of where Edinburgh now stands. The Votadini, whose territory lay east of this wall, occupied an uneasy middle position, not absorbed into the empire, not at war with it. Archaeological evidence suggests a client relationship, an arrangement in which the Votadini maintained their territory while acknowledging Roman power on their western boundary. Roman coins and objects appear at Votadini sites throughout this period. Trade happened. Influence moved in both directions. But the rock itself remained in Votadini hands. Rome reached toward Edinburgh and stopped short. By the late 4th century AD, Roman power in Britain was collapsing from the inside out. Legions were being recalled to defend the empire at its center. The Votadini were left to face whatever came next, without the buffer that Roman military presence had provided. Multiple forces moved into the vacuum. From the north came the Picts, whose exact origins historians still debate, but whose military pressure was real and sustained. From the west came Gaelic-speaking Scots, establishing a kingdom in what is now Argyll. From the south and east came the Angles, Germanic people pushing steadily northward with the same patient determination that the Roman legions had once demonstrated. The Votadini appear in early medieval sources under a new name, the Gododin, referring to both the people and their territory. And here is where Edinburgh enters the written record for the very first time, sometime around 600 AD. A poet whose name tradition records as Aneurin composed a work called Why Gododin. It is one of the oldest surviving poems in any language descended from ancient British Celtic, closely related to what would eventually become Welsh. The poem is an elegy. It mourns the warriors of the Gododin who rode south from their fortress at a place called Eidyn to fight the Angles at a place called Catraeth, most likely modern Catterick in North Yorkshire. The warriors feasted for a year before riding out. They went south, full of mead and courage and the absolute certainty of men who have been preparing for something for a very long time. Almost all of them died. The poem does not celebrate victory. There was no victory to celebrate. It records a catastrophe, and in doing so, it preserves, in the oldest surviving layer of Edinburgh's story, a truth that would echo across the centuries that followed. The rock could be defended. The city could endure. But the cost was always measured in people who did not come back. and the poem refuses to let you forget them. Eidyn, that single word, carried forward through Old English mouths that softened and shifted its sounds, through centuries of linguistic drift, is where the name Edinburgh comes from. The name of this city is a fossil, preserving inside it the memory of a people whose language died, but whose fortress outlasted them. After the defeat at Catraeth, the Eidyn world contracted under sustained angle pressure. By around 638 AD, historical evidence suggests that Eidyn itself had fallen to the Northumbrian Angles. The fortress on the rock passed out of Celtic hands for the first time in its recorded history. It was not abandoned. It was not dismantled. The rock was too valuable for any of that. Whoever held it held the key to the southeastern Scottish lowlands. Every new power that arrived understood this immediately. The Angles built on it. The Gaelic Scottish kingdom of Alba, expanding southward through the 9th and 10th centuries, recognized its strategic significance. By around 954 AD, a Scottish king called Indulf is recorded in later chronicles as having taken Edinburgh from the English. Whether this describes a specific military action or summarizes a longer shift in power is uncertain. The direction of travel was not. Edinburgh was becoming Scottish. By the mid-11th century, the fortress was part of a kingdom still defining its own shape. The rock had been held, consecutively, by Celtic Brittonic people, by Northumbrian Angles, and by Gaelic Scots. Each had understood its value. Each had added to it. Each had left something behind in the stones and the place names and the archaeological layers that modern excavators work through with careful attention. The city was still ahead. The dynasty that would build it had not yet arrived, but the rock had been ready for a very long time. Chapter 2. Din Eidyn, the fortress at the edge of the world. Consider what it means for a name to outlast the people who gave it. The Eidyn are gone. Their language has not been spoken in this part of Scotland for over 1,000 years. Their kingdom was absorbed and overwritten so completely that most people living in Edinburgh today have never heard of them. Almost everything they built has dissolved back into the earth. But the name they gave their fortress survived every political upheaval, every change of language, every conquest and reconquest. It passed through Old English mouths. It passed through Gaelic speakers. It passed through Norman French administrators. And it arrived, battered but recognizable, as Edinburgh. Every time someone says that word today, they are, without knowing it, speaking across a cultural boundary that no longer exists, connecting the present to a world that vanished over 1,000 years ago. When the Northumbrian Angles took Eidyn sometime around 638 AD, they understood immediately what they had acquired. A fortress on an unclimbable volcanic plug, commanding clear sightlines in every direction across the Lothian plain, was worth more than any comparable position on flat ground. They kept it. They built on it. They gave it a new name, combining their Old English word for a fortified place with the surviving Celtic name, Edinburgh, the fortified place of Eidyn. The name is a linguistic fossil of unusual precision. Half Brittonic Celtic, half Old English, pressed together at the moment of conquest and preserved intact across 14 centuries of change. It is a small monument to the moment two worlds collided here. The Northumbrian kingdom that now controlled Edinburgh was, in the 7th and 8th centuries, one of the most culturally significant in all of Northern Europe. The Lindisfarne Gospels, among the most beautiful objects ever made in Britain, came from this world. The Venerable Bede, whose ecclesiastical history of the English people remains a foundational text of medieval historiography, wrote from a Northumbrian monastery. Edinburgh sat at the northern frontier of this world, a garrison post valuable for defence, positioned to watch for trouble from the Pictish north and the Gaelic west. Then, in 793 AD, Norse ships attacked the monastery at Lindisfarne, and the period of sustained Norse raiding and settlement that followed transformed northern and eastern Britain more profoundly than almost any previous disruption. The Norse were not a single unified force. Groups from different parts of Scandinavia came with different objectives. Some raided and returned home. Some settled permanently and built communities that became lasting features of the landscape. Some established kingdoms that endured for generations. The Edinburgh region felt this pressure directly. The Lothian Plain was exactly the kind of productive agricultural land that settlers wanted. The Northumbrian kingdom holding this area was weakening under the combined pressure of internal conflict and sustained Norse raiding. Consider the people living on the Lothian Plain during this period. Not the kings or the warriors, but the farmers and craftsmen who made up most of the population. A man working land somewhere between the rock and the coast in the mid-9th century had grown up under Northumbrian overlordship. His father had lived through Norse raids that came up from the coast without warning. His son was growing up in a world where the effective power in this region was shifting toward Gaelic-speaking Scottish kings from the north. 3 changes of political authority within 3 generations. The field remained the same field. The river remained the same river. The rock visible on the horizon remained the same rock. The people adapted because adapting was the only viable option. This is the human reality beneath the political history of Edinburgh's early centuries. Most of the people who made this place what it was left no names in any record. They are present only in the landscape they shaped. Into the space left by weakening Northumbrian power came the kingdom of Alba. The Gaelic Scottish kingdom, consolidating in the north and west under a series of capable kings. Kenneth MacAlpin, who in the mid-9th century began bringing the Scots and Pictish kingdoms into closer political alignment, started a process of consolidation that his successors continued southward. As Northumbrian power contracted, Alba expanded to fill the gap. The transition of Edinburgh from Northumbrian to Scottish control was gradual rather than sudden. A Scottish king called Indulf, reigning from 954 to 962 AD, is recorded in later chronicles as having taken Edinburgh from the English. Whether this was a specific military action or a retrospective summary of a longer process remains uncertain. By the mid-10th century, Edinburgh was, in any practical sense, Scottish. The 11th century brought new pressures. The Danish king Knut conquered England in 1016 AD and at various points exerted influence over Scottish affairs. Edinburgh, positioned near the boundary between the Scottish kingdom and the English north, was repeatedly affected. Then, a succession crisis produced a Scottish king, whose story, a playwright, would later transform into something almost unrecognizable from the historical man. His name was Macbeth. The historical Macbeth, King of Scotland from 1040 to 1057 AD, was not the guilt-ridden figure of later theatrical tradition. He was a capable administrator who held Scotland together for 17 years of genuine stability. The clearest single piece of evidence for his confidence as a ruler is what he did in 1050 AD. He left Scotland and travelled to Rome on pilgrimage, walking away from his kingdom for months in the certain knowledge that it would still be there when he returned. A king consumed by guilt and insecurity does not do that. He was defeated and killed in 1057 AD by Malcolm, son of the previous king Duncan. With English military backing, Malcolm became king in 1058 AD, known to history as Malcolm Canmore. On the Castle Rock, St. Margaret's Chapel still stands, built by Malcolm's wife Margaret. It is the oldest surviving building in Edinburgh, a structure that has been standing for nearly 1,000 years on the same volcanic rock where Gododdin warriors once prepared for the ride south. Walk inside it now, and you are in a space that was already ancient when Robert Bruce was born. That chapel is where chapter 3 begins. Chapter 3. The Scottish kings claim their capital. She did not mean to come here. Margaret was the granddaughter of Edmund Ironside, King of England, which made her a living remnant of the old Wessex royal line that the Norman conquest of 1066 AD had swept away. When William the Conqueror defeated King Harold at Hastings, the old English royal family lost everything. Margaret and her family fled. They intended to reach the European continent and safety. Their ship was caught in storms and driven far off course, eventually making land on the Scottish coast near the Firth of Forth. Malcolm III came to meet these unexpected arrivals. When he met Margaret, he decided, with a speed unusual even for a medieval king making a dynastic calculation, that he wanted to marry her. According to later accounts, Margaret had intended to become a nun, having absorbed at the court of Edward the Confessor a vision of Christian life centered on scholarship and personal piety. The rough military culture of the Scottish court was not where she had imagined spending her life. She married Malcolm anyway, and what followed was one of the more remarkable partnerships in Scottish history. The changes Margaret brought to Scotland were cultural, religious, and institutional. She looked at the Scottish Church and saw a church that had preserved Celtic practices Rome had long since moved away from, and she pushed for reform. She brought priests and scholars from England and the continent. She made the Scottish court a place where learning and charitable giving carried real weight alongside military prowess. Margaret made Edinburgh her home with a commitment that no previous Scottish royal had brought to the place. She and Malcolm used Edinburgh Castle as their primary residence, and her presence gave it a new kind of significance. It was no longer simply a military fortification. It was a royal household, a centre of cultural life, and increasingly the most visible expression of Scottish royal power. On the castle rock she established a small chapel. St. Margaret's Chapel still stands today. It is the oldest surviving building in Edinburgh, standing for nearly 1,000 years on the same volcanic rock where Gododin warriors once prepared for the ride south. Walk inside it now, and you are in a space that Margaret herself walked through, that was built within living memory of the Norman conquest, that was already ancient when Robert Bruce was fighting for Scottish independence 3 centuries later. Margaret died in 1093 AD, 4 days after receiving news that Malcolm had been killed in battle in northern England. She was later canonized as Saint Margaret of Scotland. Her sons ruled Scotland in succession after her. The most consequential of those sons for Edinburgh was David, who became King of Scotland in 1124 AD. David I is one of the most important and most underappreciated figures in Scottish history. He had spent significant years at the Norman English court and observed closely how feudal governance worked, how towns functioned as economic engines, how a kingdom's power depended not just on military force, but on the ability to generate revenue through organized commerce and administer territory with consistent institutions. When he came to the Scottish throne, he began building all of those things. David introduced feudal governance to Scotland, reformed the Scottish Church into a diocese structure, and established a network of royal burghs, towns with trading rights granted by royal charter. That would become the commercial backbone of medieval Scotland. Edinburgh received one of the earliest and most significant of these charters, granted sometime around 1124 to 1130 AD. The charter gave Edinburgh's inhabitants the right to trade, to hold markets, and to operate under a defined legal framework. It was the moment Edinburgh stopped being merely a fortress settlement and became, legally and economically, a town. The town that developed in the castle's shadow grew along the single most logical route available to it. East from the castle, along the ridge of volcanic rock that the glacier had deposited as a long tapering tail behind the volcanic plug. The geology of Edinburgh determined the shape of its urban development with a completeness still entirely visible today. The crag and tail formation created a natural spine running east from the castle, a ridge just wide enough for a main street, with buildings on both sides, steep enough on the flanks to define the city's edges clearly. That ridge is what you call the Royal Mile today. In David's time, the buildings along it were timber-framed and constantly at risk from the fires that periodically swept through any medieval settlement. But the pattern was established. Edinburgh was a linear city, built along a volcanic spine, with the castle at the high western end and the city's other great institutional anchor taking shape at the lower eastern end. That anchor was Holyrood Abbey, which David founded in 1128 AD. The traditional story of its founding involves a miraculous encounter during a hunt, in which David was thrown from his horse, attacked by a stag, grabbed at its antlers, and found himself holding a cross, and founded the abbey in thanksgiving. Most historians regard the miracle as a later addition to what was in practical terms a straightforward act of royal religious patronage, establishing an Augustinian house with canons brought from northern England to staff it. What is not legendary is the consequence. Over the following centuries, Holyrood became one of the wealthiest and most influential religious establishments in Scotland. Scottish kings were born, married, crowned, and buried in its precincts. The royal palace that eventually grew up beside it, the Palace of Holyrood House, is still the official Scottish residence of the British monarch today. The founding of Holyrood established the fundamental physical structure of Edinburgh that has defined the city ever since. Castle at the top of the ridge, abbey and palace at the bottom, the Royal Mile connecting them. Every subsequent expansion of Edinburgh, across 9 centuries, grew outward from that original spine. Under David and his successors, Edinburgh's burgh attracted merchants from across Scotland and beyond. Flemish traders were particularly prominent in the early Scottish burghs, bringing commercial expertise and continental connections that integrated Scotland into wider European trading networks. They paid their burgh dues, traded their goods, raised their children in the shadow of the castle, and died in a city that was still becoming what it would be, without any sense that they were living at a founding moment. Nobody living at a founding moment ever does. The Cathedral Church of St. Giles, whose current building dates largely from the 14th and 15th centuries, but whose origins go back to the 12th, became the spiritual centre of the burgh. Markets were held along the high street. Craftsmen organised into guilds. The population grew slowly, constrained by disease and harvest failures, and the endemic low-level violence that limited all medieval population growth. Edinburgh was not yet Scotland's capital in any formal or exclusive sense. Scotland, in the 12th and 13th centuries, had no fixed capital. The king and court moved constantly, consuming the surplus of one royal estate before moving to the next. Perth, Stirling, Dunfermline, and Scone all played important roles. Scone was where Scottish kings were traditionally inaugurated, on the stone of destiny that symbolised the legitimacy of the Scottish crown. Edinburgh was prosperous and growing and institutionally significant, but its claim to capital status was still being made rather than established. The crisis that interrupted that process began on a stormy March night in 1286 AD. King Alexander III of Scotland rode out against the advice of his companions. His horse stumbled on a coastal path in Fife, and when they found him the following morning, his neck was broken. He left no surviving children, no clear successor, and a kingdom full of nobles with every reason to fight over what came next. What that crisis produced was a war that would mark Edinburgh permanently. The specifics of that war belong to the next chapter, but the physical evidence of its consequences is visible in Edinburgh to this day. St. Margaret's Chapel on the castle rock survived because it was too sacred to demolish even when Bruce ordered the castle walls pulled down around it. The Flodden Wall, built in panic after a later catastrophe, is still standing in sections to the south of the old town. The street plan of the Royal Mile, shaped by the same volcanic ridge that made the castle worth fighting for in the first place, is still exactly where David I laid it out 9 centuries ago. The city that Crisis built is the city you can still walk through today. Chapter 4. War, Wallace, and the Wars of Independence. 13 men believed they should be King of Scotland. That was the brutal arithmetic left behind by Alexander III's death in 1286 AD. A kingdom that had spent a century building institutions and accumulating prosperity suddenly had no clear ruler and no established mechanism for resolving a succession dispute without civil war. The 2 most serious claimants were John Balliol, whose claim came through his mother, and Robert Bruce, grandfather of the man who would become Robert I. The Scottish nobility, unable to resolve the dispute themselves without triggering the very conflict they were trying to avoid, made a decision that seemed pragmatic and proved catastrophic. They asked Edward, the First of England, to arbitrate. Edward I was one of the most capable and most ruthless rulers in medieval European history. He had already conquered Wales, crushing the last independent Welsh princes and imposing English administration with a combination of military force and legal precision that left no room for revival. When Scotland's nobles came to him for arbitration, he recognized immediately what the situation offered. Before agreeing to arbitrate, Edward demanded that the Scottish claimants acknowledge him as the feudal superior of Scotland, the overlord to whom the Scottish king owed submission. Most claimants, calculating that winning the throne was worth almost any price, agreed. In medieval feudal law, this was not an empty formality. It was a legally binding relationship with real consequences, including the right of the superior to demand military service, hear appeals from Scottish courts, and remove a king who failed his obligations. Edward chose John Balliol. Balliol was inaugurated at Scone in November of 1292 AD. Then, Edward proceeded to use the feudal relationship he had extracted to make Balliol's kingship impossible. He summoned Balliol before English courts. He demanded Scottish military service for English wars in France. He treated the King of Scotland as a subordinate official rather than a sovereign. By 1296 AD, Balliol had been pushed past the point of submission. The Scottish nobility formed an alliance with France. The Old Alliance, as it became known, was one of the longest diplomatic relationships in European history, binding Scotland and France against England, on and off, for the next 3 centuries. Edward's response was immediate and overwhelming. He crossed the border in the spring of 1296 AD. The town of Berwick, then Scotland's wealthiest trading port, was sacked with a systematic thoroughness that sent an unmistakable message about the cost of resistance. Balliol was captured, stripped of his royal insignia, in a ceremony designed to humiliate, and imprisoned. The Stone of Destiny was taken from Scone and carried south to Westminster Abbey, where Edward had it built into a new coronation chair. Then Edward came to Edinburgh. Edinburgh Castle fell in June of 1296 AD after a siege of only 3 days. Inside, the English garrison found the Scottish royal records, the documents that provided the bureaucratic foundation of a functioning kingdom. Edward ordered them taken south to England. Without its records, without its Stone of Destiny, without its king, Scotland was supposed to understand that it had ceased to exist as an independent political entity. Scotland did not accept this. The resistance came first not from the great noble families, most of whom had lands on both sides of the border and were navigating their interests with care. but from men with less to calculate and less to lose. William Wallace was a knight's son from Renfrewshire, whose biography before 1297 AD is largely unknown to us. What we know is what he did. In the spring of 1297 AD, he killed the English sheriff of Lanark, and a rising began. By summer, Wallace had assembled a significant force. He understood the military geography of his situation with unusual clarity. Scotland could not defeat English armies in open battle on flat ground, where English heavy cavalry and longbowmen had decisive advantages. The terrain of Scotland itself, its hills, its forests, its difficult river crossings, needed to be used as a weapon against any invader. The decisive demonstration came at Stirling Bridge in September of 1297 AD. An English army began crossing a narrow bridge over the River Forth. Wallace waited until enough had committed to the near bank to be trapped, but not enough had crossed to be overwhelming. When he judged the moment right, he struck. The English cavalry on the near bank was cut off and destroyed. The rest of the army, unable to cross or to help their trapped comrades, watched the catastrophe from the far bank. It was one of the most complete tactical reversals of the medieval period. Wallace was appointed Guardian of Scotland. Edinburgh Castle was retaken by Scottish forces. But Stirling Bridge was not the end of anything except the illusion that Scotland could be absorbed without serious resistance. Edward returned the following year with a larger, better prepared army. At Falkirk in 1298 AD, he used his longbowmen to systematically destroy the Scottish infantry formations before cavalry completed the work. Wallace escaped, but his political position was destroyed. He resigned as Guardian and spent several years in obscure resistance, possibly seeking support in France. He was captured in 1305 AD, betrayed to the English by a Scottish knight. Edward had him tried in Westminster Hall. Wallace's response to the charge of treason, that he could not be a traitor to a king he had never acknowledged as his own, was legally coherent and politically irrelevant. He was convicted and executed with a deliberateness intended to be exemplary. His remains were distributed to 4 corners of the country as a warning. It was the wrong lesson to draw from the wrong man. Robert Bruce, grandson of the original claimant of 1291, had spent the war years navigating between English and Scottish allegiances in ways that historians have debated ever since. He had submitted to Edward. He had also fought against Edward. He had watched Wallace rise and fall and drawn his own conclusions. He was, by the standards of any period, a politically sophisticated operator who understood that survival required a flexibility that looked, from outside, very much like unreliability. In February of 1306 AD, Bruce met John Comyn, a rival Scottish nobleman, in the Greyfriars Church in Dumfries. What was said between them is not recorded. What happened is, Bruce killed Comyn in the church. Whether this was a planned assassination or a quarrel that escaped control is a question historians have not resolved. What was beyond question was the consequence. By spilling blood in a consecrated space, Bruce had committed sacrilege. He had made permanent enemies of the entire Comyn family. He had made reconciliation with Edward impossible. He had no path left except forward. 6 weeks later, Robert Bruce was inaugurated as King of Scotland at Scone. The 8 years that followed were among the most brutal in Scottish history. Bruce's early campaigns were disasters. Defeated twice in quick succession, he was reduced to a fugitive in the Western Highlands and Islands. He came back with a strategy shaped by his understanding of what Scotland could and could not do militarily. He would not seek the open-pitched battles that Edward's forces were designed to win. He would instead destroy the castles that English forces depended on for their occupation of Scotland, not capture and hold them, which required garrisons he did not have. Destroy them. Remove them from the board entirely. Edinburgh Castle was retaken by Scottish forces in 1314 AD in one of the most audacious operations of the entire war. Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, and nephew of Bruce himself, led a small climbing party up the north face of Castle Rock in darkness. The key to the operation was a soldier named William Francis, who had grown up near the castle and had climbed that particular face as a young man visiting a girlfriend in the town. Francis knew exactly which handholds the cliff offered in the darkness and led the party up what the English garrison believed was an unclimbable approach. They surprised the garrison from an unexpected direction. The castle fell, following Bruce's standing policy. Its walls were immediately demolished. The following year came Bannockburn. In June of 1314 AD, an English army under Edward II marched north to relieve Stirling Castle, the last significant English-held fortress in Scotland. Bruce chose his ground at Bannockburn, with the same careful attention to terrain he had applied throughout the war. The English cavalry, attacking across ground that turned under them, was broken. The English army collapsed. Edward II fled south. Bannockburn did not end the war. Formal English recognition of Scottish independence did not come for another 14 years, but it established beyond serious military argument that Scotland could defend itself against the most powerful army in the British Isles. The Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, sealed in Edinburgh in 1328 AD, formally acknowledged Scottish independence and recognised Robert Bruce as its king. The city gave its name to the document that ended the war. Edinburgh Castle had been besieged and retaken repeatedly across those decades of conflict, each time at enormous human cost to the people who held it, the people who took it back, and the community living in its shadow. Among those who held out against English pressure in the years after Bannockburn was a woman named Agnes Randolph, Countess of Dunbar, known to history as Black Agnes. In 1338 AD, she defended Dunbar Castle against an English siege for 5 months with a modest garrison, directing the defence personally. At one point, she had the castle walls ostentatiously wiped down with a handkerchief after English siege engines struck them, in full view of the besieging army. In a gesture of contempt so theatrical and so precise that the English commanders understood immediately what she was saying and found it no more amusing for that understanding. She was not defending Edinburgh, but she was defending Scottish independence with exactly the character that the whole effort had required. Bruce died in 1329 AD. His 5-year-old son became David II. Edinburgh Castle fell to English forces again in 1333 AD and was held for nearly a decade before a Scottish force under Sir William Douglas retook it in 1341 AD by disguising his men as merchants to infiltrate and then overwhelm the garrison. The rock changed hands. It always changed hands. The community living in its shadow endured, paying whatever price the latest change of authority required. That endurance, quiet and undocumented and absolutely essential, is the foundation on which everything else in Edinburgh's history was built. Chapter 5. The Stuart Court and a City of Extremes. In 1450 AD, a visitor arriving in Edinburgh from London or Paris would have experienced something they were genuinely not prepared for. Not poverty, not disorder, something stranger than either of those. Vertical Edinburgh, on either side of the main street running down from the castle. Instead of the 3- and 4-story buildings common in other northern European cities of the period, there were structures rising 8, 9, 10, 11 stories into the air, timber framed at their base, stone higher up, each floor projecting slightly further over the street below as the building rose, so that by the top floors, the buildings on either side nearly touched above a pedestrian walking between them. The street itself was in almost permanent shadow. The noise was constant, layered, coming from every height simultaneously. This was Edinburgh under the Stuart kings, one of the most vertically compressed urban environments in medieval Europe. And understanding how it came to be this way tells you something essential about what Edinburgh was and what it was becoming. The Stuart dynasty came to the Scottish throne in 1371 AD when Robert Stuart, grandson of Robert I, through his mother, Marjorie Bruce, was crowned as Robert II. The Stuarts would rule Scotland, and eventually Britain, for 3.5 centuries. As a dynasty, they were uneven. Several came to the throne as children, creating the regency crises that Scottish noble families reliably exploited. Several were capable rulers who managed their difficult kingdom with genuine skill and died in ways that were neither peaceful nor expected. But they were consistent in one thing. They used Edinburgh. They developed Edinburgh Castle as a royal residence on a scale their predecessors had not attempted. They concentrated Scotland's administrative machinery in the city. The Mint, the law courts, the records of the kingdom, the offices of royal administration, all gradually settled in Edinburgh. And where those things were, the capital was in any practical sense. The vertical growth of the city was the direct consequence of its geographical constraints. The castle ridge was narrow. The ground fell away steeply on both sides. The available land along the main street was finite and growing more expensive as Edinburgh's importance increased. Building upward was the only solution available. The result was the Edinburgh tenement, a multi-story building containing multiple separate households, sharing a common stair, each occupying one or more floors. The wealthy took the upper floors, which were quieter and further from the street-level smell. The poor took the lower floors and the cellars. Aristocrats and craftsmen and servants used the same staircase every morning, an arrangement with few parallels in any other major European city of the period. This enforced social mixing produced an Edinburgh street culture that was, by medieval standards, unusually intense and unusually egalitarian in its daily texture. The taverns and markets and churches along the high street served everyone. The Edinburgh that developed in these centuries was not a city where the wealthy and the poor lived in different neighbourhoods, as they did in London or Paris. They lived at different altitudes within the same building, separated by a flight of stairs rather than a district. Under James III, who reigned from 1460 to 1488 AD, Edinburgh moved decisively toward formal capital status. James III concentrated Scotland's principal administrative institutions in Edinburgh more firmly than any of his predecessors had done. The Mint was in Edinburgh. The records were in Edinburgh. The principal law courts were in Edinburgh. The institutions that made a capital were, increasingly, in Edinburgh and nowhere else. His reign ended in the characteristically violent Stuart manner. He was killed in circumstances that remain somewhat murky, following the Battle of Souchiburn in 1488 AD, defeated by rebels who had his own son among their supporters. His son became James IV. James IV is the most appealing of the Stuart kings. He spoke multiple languages, including, according to the Spanish ambassador's written report, a working knowledge of Gaelic that no Scottish king since the early medieval period had bothered to maintain. He was interested in surgery and practiced it himself. He funded Scotland's first printing press. He corresponded with the leading intellectual figures of the European Renaissance. He was personally courageous in a way that was sometimes more theatrical than strategically sensible. Under his rule, Edinburgh became a court that European visitors took seriously. And then came Flodden, in 1513 AD. James led a Scottish army south into England in support of France, under the obligations of the Old Alliance. The English army that met him at Flodden Field in Northumberland on September 9th, 1513 AD, was commanded by the Earl of Surrey. The terrain favoured the defenders. The Scottish advance downhill broke the tactical formation that James's army depended on to function. James IV was killed on the field. He was the last monarch in Britain to die in battle. With him died the Archbishop of St. Andrews, 2 other bishops, 11 earls, 15 lords, and, according to contemporary accounts, a significant portion of Scotland's military leadership in a single afternoon. Think about what that meant for Edinburgh in the days and weeks after the news arrived. The city had sent fathers and sons and brothers to Flodden. What came back was the news that most of them were gone. There were houses in Edinburgh in the autumn of 1513 where the women who received that news never fully recovered from it. They are not recorded by name in any document that survives. They are present only in the silence where the names of their dead should appear. Edinburgh's response was immediate. The town council ordered the construction of a new defensive wall around the city within weeks of the battle. Work began with a speed that reflected genuine fear. The wall they built, sections of which still stand in the southern parts of the old town today, is known as the Flodden Wall. It was built because the people of Edinburgh understood that Scotland's military capacity had been catastrophically reduced, and that the assumptions on which their security rested could no longer be taken for granted. James IV left a 17-month-old son who became James V. Scotland entered another regency, another period of factional struggle. James V died at 30 years of age in 1542 AD, following the military defeat at Solway Moss. His health apparently broken by the accumulation of reverses in his final months. His daughter was 6 days old when she became Queen of Scotland. Her name was Mary. The Flodden Wall still stands in sections to the south of the old town. It was built from fear. In weeks, by a city that had just learned in the most brutal way possible that no wall is permanent and no victory is final. It has outlasted the fear that built it by 500 years. That is Edinburgh in a single image. The emergency becomes the monument. The panic becomes the landmark. And the city keeps walking past it every morning without knowing what it cost. Chapter 6. Knox, Mary, and the Reformation that split everything. John Knox had been a galley slave. That fact matters more than almost anything else about him, and it is worth holding before the rest of this chapter begins. Knox was captured in 1547 AD after the fall of St. Andrew's Castle, where Protestant reformers had been holding out following the assassination of the Catholic Archbishop of St. Andrews. He spent 19 months chained to an oar on a French galley, rowing until his health broke, surviving conditions that killed many of the men around him. He was released in 1549 AD, only after English diplomatic pressure secured the freedom of the Scottish prisoners. A man who survives, that does not argue in half measures. He does not compromise when he believes compromise is betrayal. He does not forgive what he believes is unforgivable. And he does not stop. Knox spent the following years in England under the Protestant Edward VI, then in exile on the continent when the Catholic Mary Tudor came to the English throne. He eventually reached Geneva, where he studied under John Calvin and absorbed a vision of Christian Reformation, so total and so radical that the moderate Protestantism of the Church of England, by comparison, looked like barely any change at all. He came back to Scotland in 1559 AD with a certainty that his contemporaries found either inspiring or terrifying, and that left almost no room for any response in between. The religious situation he returned to was already volatile. Reforming ideas had been building in Scotland for a generation, fed by Lutheran arguments from Germany, Calvinist arguments from Geneva, Protestant influence from England, and deep popular resentment of a Catholic Church that was, in the eyes of its critics, more concerned with protecting its wealth and political position than with the spiritual welfare of ordinary people. The political situation was equally unstable. The country was governed by Mary of Guise, the French mother of the infant Mary Queen of Scots, serving as regent while her daughter grew up at the French court. Mary of Guise was Catholic, French in her political loyalties, and committed to maintaining the French military alliance. Against her stood a coalition of Protestant Scottish nobles who called themselves the Lords of the Congregation, wanting religious reform and also, not coincidentally, wanting the French military presence in Scotland reduced. Knox was the voice of this movement, not its political leader. He understood the distinction and stayed within it. He preached, he wrote, he argued with a ferocity and a personal certainty that everyone who encountered him found impossible to ignore, even those who despised his conclusions. His most famous written work, a tract called The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women, was an argument against female rulers aimed at the Catholic queens then governing Scotland and England. Its publication timing was one of the most consequential miscalculations in Scottish religious history. It appeared just as Elizabeth I, Protestant and female, came to the English throne. Elizabeth did not forgive him. Knox spent years afterward attempting to explain that he had not meant her specifically. She remained unpersuaded for the rest of her long reign. In Edinburgh, the Reformation moved with a speed and a violence that transformed the physical city within months. The great religious houses that David I had established 4 centuries earlier were attacked. The interior of St. Giles Cathedral was stripped of its Catholic furnishings. Statues and altarpieces that had been objects of devotion for generations were pulled down and destroyed. In 1560 AD, the Scottish Parliament, meeting in Edinburgh, passed legislation abolishing papal authority in Scotland, prohibiting the Mass, and adopting a Protestant confession of faith that Knox had largely written himself. Scotland moved from officially Catholic to officially Protestant in the space of a parliamentary session. The Calvinist Reformation Knox brought to Scotland was not the moderate kind. It stripped worship back to what he and his colleagues believed was the pure practice of the early Christian church. No altars, no vestments, no polyphonic music, only plain psalm singing, no images of any kind, no prayers for the dead, no purgatory, no saints as intercessors. Buildings that had been filled for centuries with color and carved wood and painted stone, and the accumulated donations of generations were emptied and whitewashed. And then, in August of 1561 AD, the Queen arrived. Mary, Queen of Scots, was 18 years old. She had grown up at the most sophisticated court in Europe. French was her first language. She had been briefly Queen of France before her husband Francis II died, leaving her a widow at 18, with no obvious role at the French court, and a kingdom in Scotland she barely remembered, and had not seen since she was 5 years old. She was returning to rule a country whose language she spoke imperfectly, and whose religion had just been transformed in ways she found both incomprehensible and threatening. She was also, by every contemporary account, a person of extraordinary personal presence. Tall, graceful, well-educated in the Renaissance manner. She possessed a warmth and a directness that contemporaries on both sides of every division consistently remarked upon. Even Knox, who despised everything she represented, acknowledged in his own history that her manner was compelling in ways that made argument with her genuinely difficult. The confrontations between Knox and Mary are among the most extraordinary in Scottish history. They met in formal audience at least 4 times. Knox laid out his theological and political positions directly to the Queen's face. Mary argued back with an intelligence and a composure that Knox found unsettling in someone he had expected to dismiss more easily. He told her plainly that he would prefer to live under a wise Protestant male ruler than under even the wisest Catholic queen. She did not have him imprisoned. She managed him with a patience that tells you something important about how carefully she was reading the political situation she had inherited. Mary set up her court at Holyrood House, the palace that had grown up beside the ruins of Holyrood Abbey. She maintained her Catholic faith in her private chapel. She made no attempt to reverse the Protestant settlement that the Parliament had established. She tried to position herself as a queen above the religious divide, serving all her subjects regardless of their faith. It was a sophisticated and in many ways admirable political strategy. In the Scotland of the 1560s, it was very nearly impossible to sustain. The events that destroyed Mary's position unfolded with a speed and a melodrama that 4.5 centuries have not made any less remarkable. She married her cousin Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, in 1565 AD. The marriage satisfied her dynastic interests, but proved personally catastrophic. Darnley was vain, jealous, and politically incompetent. The crisis broke on an evening in March of 1566 AD, in a small room in Holyrood House that visitors can still enter today. Mary was 6 months pregnant. She was having supper in her private apartments with a small group, including her Italian private secretary, David Rizzio, who had become indispensable to her and was consequently resented by the Protestant lords who believed he exercised undue influence over the Queen. Darnley, manipulated by those lords, led a group of armed men into the room. They seized Rizzio and stabbed him repeatedly, in front of the pregnant Queen, in her own private apartments. Contemporary accounts, from people who were present or who spoke immediately with those who were, record that the number of wounds was very large, with different witnesses giving different counts. Whatever the precise number, the act was intended to be witnessed by Mary, intended to demonstrate that she could not protect even those in her most immediate circle. Mary survived the shock. She maintained her composure through the immediate aftermath with a control that witnesses found remarkable. She managed to detach Darnley from his allies within days. She fled Edinburgh. She attempted to recover her position. She never fully succeeded. Her marriage to Darnley deteriorated into open mutual contempt. In February of 1567 AD, Darnley was killed when the house where he was staying in Edinburgh, a property called Kirk o' Field, was destroyed in an explosion. His body was found in the garden, apparently strangled rather than killed by the blast itself. Who killed him remains, after 4.5 centuries of investigation, genuinely uncertain. What destroyed Mary was not the murder, but what she did 3 months afterward. She married James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, the man most widely suspected of killing Darnley. Whatever her reasons, the effect on her reputation was irreversible. The Protestant lords moved against her. She was captured, imprisoned in Loch Leven Castle, and forced to abdicate in favour of her 13-month-old son, who became James VI. She escaped the following year, raised an army, was defeated at the Battle of Langside, and crossed the Solway Firth into England in a small fishing boat, throwing herself on the mercy of her cousin Elizabeth I of England. Elizabeth kept her imprisoned for 19 years and then had her executed at Fotheringhay Castle in February of 1587 AD. Mary dressed in red for her execution. Red was the Catholic colour of martyrdom. She was 44 years old, and she understood ceremony precisely enough to make a final statement with the colour of her clothing. Her son, James VI, ruled from Edinburgh, intellectually gifted and politically shrewd in ways that his turbulent upbringing should have made impossible. Under him, Edinburgh functioned as a capital with increasing confidence. The institutions were there. The administrative machinery was there. The printing press was producing books that were changing Scottish intellectual and religious culture. And then, in 1603 AD, Elizabeth I died without an heir. James VI of Scotland was her closest living royal relative. He left Edinburgh in April of 1603 AD, promising to return regularly. He came back once. 14 years later, Edinburgh had lost its king, but what it kept? Its institution, its church, its legal system, its university, its increasingly confident civic identity, would prove more durable than anyone standing in its streets in 1603 AD could yet understand. The city had survived worse than an absent monarch. It was about to find out how much worse the next century intended to be. Chapter 7. Plague, Covenant, and Cromwell. There is a document in Edinburgh's city records from 1645 AD that is, by any modern standard, almost unimaginable as an instrument of public policy. It authorizes the physical nailing shut of doors. Not metaphorically. Doors of houses where plague had been identified were literally sealed. People inside were confined to their homes. Food was passed through windows by people who tried to stand as far back as the narrow streets allowed. Guards were posted to prevent anyone from leaving. The penalty for breaking out was death. This was standard operating procedure. The protocol that city authorities reached for when the plague came, because it was the only tool available that might reduce the spread of a disease for which no medical treatment existed. It worked imperfectly. It always worked imperfectly. The plague of 1644 to 1645 AD killed. According to contemporary Edinburgh records and the analysis of later historians, somewhere between a quarter and a third of the city's population. The range in that estimate is itself significant. When a city is dying at that rate, systematic record-keeping collapses, along with everything else. We know the scale was severe. We cannot measure it with false precision. This was not Edinburgh's first plague, and the people of the city knew it. The Black Death had reached Scotland in 1349 AD. Subsequent outbreaks had visited Edinburgh at intervals across 3 centuries. For the people of pre-modern Edinburgh, plague was not an exceptional catastrophe. It was a recurring fact of life, the kind of thing that every generation knew would come again, that they could neither predict nor prevent, and that they survived through whatever combination of organization, isolation, and simple biological luck happened to work that particular time. What made 1645 exceptional was not just the scale of the death, it was the context into which the death arrived. Edinburgh, in 1645 AD, was a city already under severe and sustained pressure from the most serious political and religious crisis Scotland had experienced since the Wars of Independence. A crisis that had been building for nearly a decade. A crisis that had its origin in a single act of royal miscalculation in 1637 AD. James VI had died in 1625 AD, leaving the throne to his son Charles. Charles I was a man of genuine personal qualities, of physical courage and aesthetic sensibility and sincere religious faith. He was also a man of catastrophic political judgment, possessed of an absolute confidence in his own understanding of what God required of him, that made compromise feel like betrayal and consultation feel like weakness. He governed 3 kingdoms and seems genuinely not to have understood that each of them had its own culture, its own institutions, its own history of relationship with royal power that had to be navigated rather than overridden. In 1637 AD, Charles decided that Scotland's church would use a new prayer book based on the Church of England's liturgy. He did not consult the Scottish Church. He did not consult the Scottish Parliament. He issued the order from London and assumed it would be obeyed. The first reading of the new prayer book took place in St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh in July of 1637 AD. Within moments of the service beginning, members of the congregation began to shout protests. Objects were thrown. The officiating minister was driven from the building. Riots spread through the city. Later tradition attached the name Jenny Geddes to the woman said to have thrown the first stool, crediting her with starting the crisis with a single act of defiance. Whether she was a real individual or a name that tradition later attached to an anonymous moment of collective outrage is a question historians have debated without resolution. What is not debatable is that something was thrown, that it captured a genuine and widespread fury, and that Edinburgh's streets that day were the beginning of a crisis that would eventually cost a king his head. Within months, Scots across the country were signing the National Covenant, a declaration that the Scottish Church was independent of royal interference in matters of doctrine and worship. The Covenanters ranged from moderates who believed the crisis could be resolved by negotiation to hardliners who believed that any compromise was a sin against God. What united them was the conviction that Charles had no legitimate authority over the form of their worship. Charles attempted to use military force to suppress the covenanting movement. He failed twice. In the two bishops' wars of 1639 and 1640, producing armies that either refused to engage seriously or were defeated before they could, forced to call the English Parliament to raise money for a proper campaign. He discovered that the English Parliament had accumulated its own extensive list of grievances against him. The conflict that had started in Edinburgh's St. Giles Cathedral was spreading far beyond Scotland. Into this context, already exhausted by years of political crisis, already strained by the financial demands of the Covenanting armies, came the plague of 1644 to 1645 AD. Edinburgh was trying to fight a constitutional war and bury its dead simultaneously. When the plague finally burned itself out, the political crisis had not ended. It had only changed shape. The English Civil War that resulted from the confrontation between Charles and the English Parliament ended in Charles's defeat, capture, trial, and execution. In January of 1649 AD, the execution of a reigning king by his own parliament shocked every European court. In Edinburgh, the reaction was complex. The Scots had their own genuine grievances against Charles. But Scotland was a monarchist country, and the dead king's son was available in exile on the continent, willing to sign the National Covenant in exchange for Scottish military support. He signed it in 1650 AD. He was crowned Charles II at Scone. The Scots raised an army and marched south. Oliver Cromwell met them at Dunbar, on the coast just south of Edinburgh. In September of 1650 AD, the Scottish army outnumbered the English force and held a strong defensive position on the high ground above the town. In the days immediately before the battle, the Presbyterian ministers, who had accompanied the army as spiritual advisors, pressured the commanders to purge soldiers whose moral conduct they considered insufficiently righteous. Hundreds of experienced men were removed from the ranks on theological grounds. Cromwell, watching from below as the enemy weakened itself through internal argument about who was righteous enough to fight, waited for his moment and attacked in the early hours of September 3rd. The Scottish army was destroyed in a matter of hours. Cromwell marched into Edinburgh. After a brief siege, the castle fell. For the first time since the Wars of Independence, a foreign army occupied Edinburgh as a deliberate and sustained political occupation. Scotland was incorporated into the Cromwellian Commonwealth by force. The English soldiers who garrisoned Edinburgh during the occupation were men from English counties who had never been to Scotland, did not speak Scots, did not understand the particular intensity of Scottish Presbyterian religious conviction, and were enforcing a political settlement that the people they were governing had not chosen and did not accept. Some of those soldiers wrote letters home, as soldiers always do. In those letters, you can read the experience of military occupation from the occupier's side, the boredom and the unease, and the knowledge that the people around you tolerate your presence without accepting it. Edinburgh, under Cromwell, functioned but under sustained strain. The Scottish Parliament was abolished. Scottish representatives, were summoned to a combined parliament in London, a gesture toward incorporation that satisfied nobody about where actual power lay. The Quakers arrived, and the Baptists, and the various sects that the English Civil War had generated, bringing a range of religious opinion to Edinburgh that the Presbyterian establishment regarded with a horror it found difficult to express without sounding like the Catholic clergy it had displaced. Cromwell died in 1658 AD. His son Richard could not maintain the Commonwealth. In 1660 AD, Charles II was restored. The English garrison left Edinburgh. The Scottish Parliament reconvened. But the restoration did not restore the world that had existed before the crisis. Charles II, who had signed the National Covenant to gain Scottish support and abandoned it the moment his throne was secure, imposed bishops back onto the Scottish Church. Hundreds of ministers who refused to accept episcopal ordination were ejected from their churches. They continued to preach at outdoor gatherings called conventicles, illegal by the government's own definition. The government sent soldiers to suppress the conventicles. Running engagements continued across the southwest of Scotland throughout the 1660s and 1670s in what became known as the Killing Time. Edinburgh was the administrative centre of this repression. The Privy Council that directed it met in Edinburgh. The courts that tried Covenanters met in Edinburgh. Public executions of Covenanting leaders took place on the High Street, before crowds, whose mood the authorities could not always predict or control. The tension between Edinburgh's institutional role and its population's religious sympathies was a feature of daily life throughout this period. The crisis sharpened further under Charles II's brother and successor, James VII of Scotland and II of England, who came to the throne in 1685 AD. James was openly Catholic. His Catholicism, in a country where the memory of the Reformation's violence was still living rather than historical, was politically explosive. His attempts to extend religious toleration to Catholics alongside Protestant dissenters satisfied almost nobody and alarmed almost everybody. In 1688 AD, the English Parliament invited the Dutch Protestant William of Orange to invade England and replace James. William came. James fled. The Glorious Revolution installed a Protestant monarchy. Edinburgh moved immediately. The Privy Council dissolved itself. A convention of the Scottish estates offered the crown to William and Mary. The Presbyterian church settlement that the Covenanters had fought for across decades of repression was finally, formally, permanently established as the Church of Scotland. Knox had won. He had been dead for over a century. But the church he had envisioned was now the established Church of Scotland. The struggle that had begun in St. Giles in 1560 AD was, in a formal sense, over. But the political question that had been building since James VI rode south in 1603 AD remained entirely unresolved. Scotland had its church, its legal system, its parliament. It had a king who lived in London and whose attention would always be drawn primarily toward his larger, wealthier, more powerful southern kingdom. The answer came in 1707 AD, and it arrived as the deepest institutional wound the city had suffered since the Wars of Independence. The years leading up to the Acts of Union were among the most politically intense Edinburgh had experienced. The Scottish Parliament debated the terms of union with a passion and a bitterness that contemporary observers described in terms that make their accounts feel immediate today. The English writer Daniel Defoe was in Edinburgh during these months, working as a political intelligence agent for the English government. He would later become famous as the author of Robinson Crusoe. In 1705 and 1706, he was watching Edinburgh's streets with a professional observer's eye and reporting what he saw with a novelist's precision. Defoe described streets densely packed with crowds whose opposition to union was not manufactured, but genuinely felt. He described members of Parliament requiring escorts to reach the Parliament building on the Royal Mile. He described a city that understood perfectly well what it was being asked to give up. The vote passed anyway. In January of 1707 AD, the Scottish Parliament voted itself out of existence. Scotland kept its church, its legal system, and its universities. It gained access to English colonial trade networks. It lost its parliament. On the 1st of May 1707 AD, the Acts of Union came into force. The building on the Royal Mile that had housed the Scottish Parliament was repurposed. The institution itself was gone. Daniel Defoe, who had watched it all from the streets and the coffee houses and the Parliament building itself, left Edinburgh shortly afterward. He had seen a city that knew exactly what it was losing and had not been able to stop it. He wrote about Edinburgh with the precision and the sympathy that the best observers always bring to places they have watched in their most vulnerable moments. He had been sent as a spy. He left as something closer to a witness. The city that had fought for its independence for 4 centuries had negotiated it away at a table, and in the silence that followed, something extraordinary began to stir. Not a political revival, not a military resistance. Something that nobody standing in Edinburgh's streets in 1707 AD could have predicted. The city that had lost its parliament was about to produce ideas that changed the entire world. Chapter 8. The Scottish Enlightenment. The Athens of the North. In 1748 AD, a young man arrived in Edinburgh to give a series of public lectures on rhetoric and jurisprudence. He was 25 years old, from a small coastal town called Kirkcaldy across the Firth of Forth, and he had studied at Glasgow and at Oxford, and had found Oxford so intellectually stagnant that he later described his time there as the most unproductive years of his life. Edinburgh was different. Edinburgh was, in 1748, a city alive with argument and inquiry in ways that Oxford was not. His name was Adam Smith. The book he would eventually publish, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, appeared in 1776 AD, nearly 30 years after those first Edinburgh lectures. It is still in print. It is still argued over in universities and government ministries on every continent. By most accounts, it is the foundational text of modern economics. Smith was not alone in Edinburgh. That is the thing that makes the Scottish Enlightenment genuinely astonishing when you examine it closely. In a city of roughly 60,000 people, in a country of roughly 1.5 million, in a span of approximately 50 years, centered on the middle of the 18th century, an extraordinary concentration of intellectual talent produced work that shaped the modern world in ways still felt today. David Hume, whose philosophical skepticism challenged the foundations of religious belief, and whose theory of causation remains a central problem in philosophy. James Hutton, whose observations of Scottish rocks produced the theory of deep geological time and helped establish the science of geology. Joseph Black, who identified carbon dioxide, developed the concept of latent heat, and trained a generation of Scottish chemists whose influence spread across Europe and America. James Watt, who worked primarily in Glasgow, but whose intellectual formation was entirely Scottish, who developed the separate condenser that made the steam engine efficient enough to power an industrial revolution. William Cullen, who transformed medical education at a time when Edinburgh's medical school was already the most respected in the English-speaking world. Francis Hutcheson, whose moral philosophy influenced both Hume and Smith, and whose thinking about natural rights contributed to the intellectual currents from which the American Declaration of Independence eventually emerged. These were not isolated geniuses working alone in separate rooms. They knew each other. They read each other. They argued with each other in the taverns and clubs and drawing rooms of a city compact enough that everyone who mattered to the conversation could reach everyone else within a short walk. They taught each other's students. They built on each other's work with a collaborative intensity that produced something larger than any of them could have generated individually. Every historian of this period eventually confronts the same question that Edinburgh people of the time asked themselves with a mixture of pride and genuine bewilderment. Why here? Why now? Why did this happen in this specific city at this specific moment rather than somewhere else? The answers are multiple, and none of them alone is adequate. The first answer is institutional. Edinburgh's University, founded in 1583 AD, had developed by the early 18th century a culture of genuine intellectual engagement that stood in sharp contrast to Oxford and Cambridge, which contemporary observers, including scholars who had studied at both, described as intellectually complacent. Edinburgh's medical school in particular was world-class by any standard. Students came from across Britain, from continental Europe, and from the American colonies to study medicine in Edinburgh, and they brought energy and connections that fed into the broader intellectual life of the city. The second answer is social. Edinburgh's peculiar vertical compression, the mixing of social classes that the tenement culture had enforced across centuries, meant that ideas moved across social boundaries more freely than in almost any other European city. A professor and a merchant, and a lawyer and a craftsman might live in the same clothes off the high street, drink at the same tavern, belong to the same debating club. Edinburgh, in the Enlightenment period, was a city of clubs. The Select Society, the Poker Club, the Oyster Club. These were not merely social gatherings. They were the spaces where ideas were tested against intelligent skepticism in real-time conversation between people who would not, in London or Paris, have occupied the same room. The third answer is psychological. Scotland, in 1707 AD, had lost its parliament and faced a genuine crisis of national identity. The institutions that remained, the church, the legal system, the universities, became the repositories of Scottish distinctiveness in ways they had not been before. Scottish intellectuals of the Enlightenment generation invested enormous energy in those institutions precisely because they were what was left. The Scottish Enlightenment was, in part, a response to political loss. A nation that could no longer express itself through Parliament expressed itself through ideas. The fourth answer is economic. The Union had delivered the commercial benefits its supporters had promised. Scottish merchants gained access to English colonial markets. Edinburgh's professional classes were prospering in ways their parents had not. And prosperity created the leisure and the surplus that sustained intellectual institutions. None of these answers fully explains why this particular collection of brilliant people happened to be alive at the same time in the same city. Some extraordinary concentrations of talent resist complete causal explanation. What we can say with confidence is that the conditions were right, and that the people who arrived in those conditions made the most of them, to a degree that has rarely been equaled anywhere. David Hume is worth dwelling on at length, because his story captures something essential about what Edinburgh was during this period, and because he was, by most measures, one of the greatest philosophers to write in the English language. Hume was born in Edinburgh in 1711 AD. He grew up in a culture where Calvinist theology was the intellectual air that educated people breathed, where questions of predestination and divine sovereignty were not abstract academic puzzles, but living issues with real consequences for how you understood your place in the universe. He absorbed that culture completely. Then, with a philosophical rigor that his contemporaries found deeply unsettling, he took it apart, piece by piece. His treatise of human nature, published in 1739 and 1740 AD, when he was in his late 20s, argued that all human knowledge derives from sense experience. That causation is not something we observe in the world, but a habit of mind we impose on our observations, and that the self is not a unified, continuous entity, but a bundle of perceptions with no underlying substance. The implications for religious belief were clear. Hume did not always hide from them. He was denied a professorship at Edinburgh University in 1745 AD on grounds of his allegedly atheistical views. The campaign against him was led by Edinburgh's Presbyterian ministers. Hume, who was, by all contemporary accounts, one of the most personally warm and socially adept people in 18th century Edinburgh, a man famous for his good humour and his generosity as a dinner companion, responded with an equanimity that his opponents found deeply infuriating. He continued to write. He was invited to the best tables in the city. He became librarian of the Faculty of Advocates, gaining access to one of the largest book collections in Scotland. James Boswell, the Edinburgh-born biographer who would later produce the most celebrated biography in English literature with his life of Samuel Johnson, encountered Hume repeatedly in Edinburgh's intellectual circles during these years. Boswell was himself tormented by religious anxiety, swinging between periods of devout Presbyterianism and periods of doubt that he recorded in his journals with remarkable honesty. He was drawn to Hume precisely because Hume represented the philosophical position that most frightened him. He visited Hume on his deathbed in 1776 AD, hoping, or perhaps fearing, to find the philosopher reconsidering his positions in the face of death. Hume displayed instead a calm acceptance of annihilation that Boswell found both admirable and profoundly disturbing. Hume told him that the expectation of ceasing to exist was perfectly comfortable. Boswell left shaken and wrote about the encounter in his journal with the honesty that made him one of the great diarists of his century. The encounter captures something essential about Edinburgh in this period, a city where the most radical intellectual challenges to established belief were not happening in isolation, but in conversation, face to face, at bedsides and dinner tables and club meetings, between people who knew each other and cared what the other thought. Hume died in 1776 AD, the same year that Smith published The Wealth of Nations and the American Colonies, declared independence partly through arguments that owed something to the intellectual traditions Hutcheson and Hume had helped create. Edinburgh lost its most celebrated citizen in the same summer that the world was changing in ways his ideas had helped make possible. James Hutton's contribution to human knowledge was different in character, but no less revolutionary in its long-term consequences. Hutton was born in Edinburgh in 1726 AD, trained as a physician, worked as a farmer for some years, and eventually devoted himself to the systematic observation of rocks. He spent years examining the geological formations of Scotland, particularly the coastal exposures at a place called Sicker Point in Berwickshire, where the physical arrangement of rock layers showed evidence of processes of deposition and uplift and erosion and redeposition that could only be explained by timescales that no existing intellectual framework could accommodate. The standard educated view of his era held that the Earth was approximately 6,000 years old, calculated from the genealogies in the Bible. Hutton looked at Sicker Point and understood with a clarity that must have been disorienting that 6,000 years was not remotely adequate to explain what he was seeing. The processes observable in the present, the slow accumulation of river sediment, the gradual erosion of coastlines, operating at their observable rates over the time required to produce the rock sequences he was examining, implied an age for the Earth that was not thousands of years, but millions, perhaps hundreds of millions. He presented his theory to the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 1785 AD and published it formally in his Theory of the Earth in 1788 AD. He concluded his paper with a sentence that became one of the most quoted in the history of science. Looking at the rock record, he wrote, he found no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end. Hutton had given the Earth deep time, He had provided the temporal framework without which Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, published 71 years later, would have been literally unthinkable. Darwin acknowledged the intellectual debt explicitly. All of this intellectual activity was happening in a city that was simultaneously undergoing the most dramatic physical transformation in its history. The old town on the castle ridge had reached, by the 1750s, a state of genuine crisis. It was overcrowded beyond anything its infrastructure had been built to support. Water supply was inadequate for the population using it. Sanitation was catastrophic by any standard. Disease rates were high and climbing. The wealthy residents who had previously accepted Edinburgh's enforced vertical social mixing as an unavoidable fact of life were asking, for the first time, whether there might be an alternative. In 1760 AD, Edinburgh's town council began planning an expansion of the city beyond the ridge. The proposal was to drain a marshy valley to the north, build a bridge across the resulting flat ground, and develop an entirely new residential district on the hills above it. In 1766 AD, a design competition was held. The winning submission came from James Craig, a young architect in his early 20s, with no significant previous work to his name, whose plan was a model of rational Enlightenment urban thinking. Craig's design for the new town was a grid, 3 parallel streets running east to west, connected by perpendicular cross streets, anchored by garden squares at each end. George Street along the central spine, Prince's Street on the southern edge, looking across the drained valley toward the castle, Queen Street along the northern edge, Charlotte Square at the west, St. Andrew's Square at the east. Here is a detail that most accounts of the new town leave out, and it is the detail that explains why Prince's Street looks the way it looks today, why one of the most photographed views in Europe exists at all. The original property arrangements for Prince's Street included conditions that prevented construction on the south side of the street. The reason was not aesthetic vision. It was a combination of commercial interests from property owners on the north side who did not want their light blocked, and civic pressure to protect the valley view. The magnificent unobstructed sightline from Prince's Street across the valley to the castle, the view that millions of tourists have stood and photographed, exists because of a property arrangement in an 18th century land sale. Nobody planned to create one of the great urban vistas in the world. They planned to protect property values, and the view took care of itself. The new town's construction proceeded steadily across the last decades of the 18th century and into the 19th. Robert Adam, the most celebrated British architect of his generation, designed Charlotte Square, bringing to it a classical refinement that set the standard for the entire development. Adam died in 1792 AD, before Charlotte Square was completed. But the building proceeded according to his designs, a common fate for architectural visionaries working at the scale the new town required. The social consequences of the new town were immediate and transformative. Edinburgh's wealthy and professional classes moved north across the bridge in large numbers, vacating the upper floors of old town tenements. The buildings did not stand empty. They were taken by poorer families, moving in at greater density, occupying spaces that had previously been shared more broadly. Edinburgh had, within a single generation, sorted itself by wealth into 2 distinct geographical zones: the new town for the prosperous, the old town for the poor. The social mixing that had been Edinburgh's defining urban characteristic for 3 centuries. The characteristic that had made possible the particular quality of intellectual life, where a philosopher and a merchant and a craftsman might use the same stair, dissolved almost entirely. The man who did most to shape how the outside world understood both Edinburgh's and how Scotland understood itself in this period was not an architect or a philosopher or a scientist. He was a novelist. Walter Scott was born in Edinburgh in 1771 AD. Grew up partly in the Scottish borders, trained as a lawyer, and became the most widely read novelist in the English-speaking world during the first 3 decades of the 19th century. His Waverley novels, beginning with Waverley in 1814 AD, invented historical fiction in the modern sense, placing characters in precisely researched historical periods and using their experiences to illuminate the forces of historical change. They were also extraordinarily successful. Scott's novels sold in numbers that no previous novelist in any language had achieved. They defined for an entire generation of international readers what Scotland was, what its history meant, and what its people were like. The Scotland Scott created was romantic, heroic, and elegiac. The Highlands became, through his fiction, a landscape of noble warriors and lost causes. Medieval Scotland was chivalric and adventurous. Scott understood perfectly well that he was idealizing. He was a trained lawyer with a sophisticated historical intelligence. He knew that the Highland society he was romanticizing had been brutally suppressed after the Jacobite Rising of 1745 AD, and that Highland communities were being cleared for sheep farming in his own lifetime. He also understood something about how national identity works. Scotland needed a story about itself that was not purely a story of defeat and absorption. Scott provided that story. He gave Scotland a usable past, dramatic enough to be proud of and sufficiently anchored in real history to be respectable. In 1822 AD, King George IV visited Edinburgh, the first visit by a reigning British monarch to Scotland in well over a century. Scott organised the visit with a theatrical genius that transformed it into a spectacle of Scottish national identity. He persuaded the king to appear in Highland dress. He orchestrated processions and pageants. He created, in the space of a few weeks, the visual vocabulary of tartans and kilts and Highland pageantry that became, for the following 2 centuries, the way Scotland was represented to the world. Much of this imagery was recent invention. The specific clan tartans that tourists buy in Edinburgh's Royal Mile shops today were largely codified in the 1820s, partly in preparation for and response to the royal visit. Scott knew this and proceeded anyway. He was creating something that Scotland needed more than it needed strict historical accuracy about textile patterns. Edinburgh, in 1850 AD, was recognisably the city that visitors see today. The castle on its rock, the Royal Mile running east from it, the old town on the ridge, somewhat improved, but still carrying its medieval structure in its closes and courts. The new town, stretching north in Georgian regularity, its stone terraces and garden squares embodying the rational principles of the Enlightenment era that had produced them. 2 cities in one, 2 Scotlands in one, the rational and the romantic, the modern and the medieval, the prosperous and the struggling. Edinburgh had always held incompatible things together. The new town and the old town were the most visible expression of that capacity in the city's physical form. Chapter 9. The New Town and the Invention of Modern Urban Planning. On a cold morning in October of 1767 AD, the first stone was laid for the North Bridge, the structure that would physically connect Edinburgh's Old Town to the new district under construction on the hills to the north. It collapsed during construction, killing 5 people. This was not a promising beginning for one of the most ambitious urban projects in 18th century Europe. The collapse was investigated, causes identified, the design revised, construction resumed. The bridge was completed in 1772 AD. The new town, it connected to the old town, began to fill. But while the new town was being built and admired, the old town was undergoing a transformation in the opposite direction. By the 1830s, the closes and tenements of Edinburgh's Old Town contained some of the most densely populated and physically deteriorated urban housing in the British Isles. Families crowded into single rooms in buildings that had been constructed for wealthy occupants in earlier centuries and were now occupied at densities no building could sustainably support. Water came from shared wells that were inadequate in volume and dangerously close to sources of contamination. Sanitation depended on practices that guaranteed the contamination of whatever water supply existed. Infant mortality in the worst parts of the Old Town was among the highest recorded anywhere in Britain. In 1862 AD, Edinburgh appointed its first medical officer of health, a physician named Henry Littlejohn. Littlejohn was not a social revolutionary. He was a scientist and a doctor who believed that accurate measurement was the necessary first step toward effective action. His report, delivered to the City Council in 1865 AD, documented the Old Town's conditions with a precision and a moral clarity that contemporary readers found simultaneously admirable and deeply uncomfortable. He recorded the density of population per acre in each district. He recorded infant mortality rates. He recorded the relationship between sanitation infrastructure and disease rates. He mapped Edinburgh's death rate across its different neighbourhoods with a geographical specificity that made the consequences of the two-city divide impossible to look away from. Some of the passages in Littlejohn's report read, "Even today," with a plainness that no rhetoric could match. He described families of 6 and 7 people living in rooms of 10 or 11 feet on each side. He described children who had never slept in a bed. He described specific closes where specific water sources were producing specific disease patterns. Not poverty in the abstract, but preventable death with an address. When he wrote that the conditions in certain parts of the Old Town were incompatible with health, he was not using that phrase as a polite euphemism. He was using it as a clinical finding. What the map showed was stark. In the Newtown districts, mortality rates were consistent with what the Victorian middle class considered acceptable urban living. In the worst Old Town districts, mortality rates were roughly double the Newtown figures. The gap was not explained by poverty alone. It was explained by the specific conditions in which people lived. The contaminated water, the inadequate ventilation, the density that made disease transmission nearly inevitable once any infectious illness entered a building. Littlejohn's report became the foundation for decades of Old Town improvement work. New water supply infrastructure was built. Sewers were constructed. Streets were widened, which required demolishing buildings but also reduced the density in the worst affected areas. The improvement was real, slow, underfunded relative to the scale of the problem, and conducted with more attention to the convenience of the city's wealthier residents than to the welfare of the poor people whose neighbourhoods were being disrupted. The man most associated with the large-scale physical transformation was William Chambers, who became Lord Provost of Edinburgh in 1865 AD and pushed through an improvement programme still visible in the fabric of the old city today. Some of what Chambers demolished had genuine historical value not recognised as such at the time. But before the demolitions came, the attempts at rehabilitation. And the most interesting figure in Edinburgh's 19th century urban story is not Chambers, but someone far less celebrated outside specialist circles. Patrick Geddes was a biologist, a sociologist, and a town planner, and one of the most original minds in Edinburgh's long history of original minds. Born in 1854 AD, he moved into the Old Town himself in the 1880s, into the very closes and courts that his contemporaries regarded as lost causes, and began buying and restoring buildings, not to make them suitable for the wealthy, but to make them habitable for the people already living in them. Geddes believed, against the dominant reforming opinion of his era, that the solution to urban poverty was not to demolish the environment and scatter the community, but to improve the environment while keeping the community intact. He restored buildings, created student residences and artists' studios and public reading rooms in the closes off the Royal Mile, established rooftop gardens on Old Town tenements, and argued in a series of publications that the social fabric of a neighbourhood was itself a resource that demolition destroyed, along with the bad housing. He was largely ignored in Edinburgh during his active years there. His ideas were more influential internationally. In France, in India, in America, where urban planners encountered his writings and found in them a framework that felt both principled and practical. He is recognized today as one of the founders of modern urban planning theory. Edinburgh, as with several of its greatest minds, understood what it had after it had let him move on. By the middle of the 19th century, Edinburgh had established a pattern that would persist for generations. The old town as the historic, occasionally romanticized, and chronically underfunded physical core of the city. The new town and its extensions as the address of everyone who could afford to choose where they lived. The gap between them measured not in hundreds of yards of physical distance, but in life expectancy, in infant survival rates, in the probability that a child born in one would live to adulthood in ways that a child born in the other took entirely for granted. Walter Scott's romantic reimagining of Scotland had made Edinburgh fashionable to visit. The new town made it elegant to live in, for those who could afford it. The old town made it dangerous, for those who had no choice. Edinburgh had always been a city of contradictions, held together in a single place. In the 19th century, those contradictions were written into its geography with a clarity that required deliberate effort not to see. Chapter 10. Industry, Empire, and the Dark Side of Progress. Robert Louis Stevenson was born in Edinburgh in 1850 AD. The son of a lighthouse engineer from a family that had built lighthouses around the Scottish coast for generations. He grew up in the new town, explored the old town, absorbed the contrasts of the two cities he inhabited from childhood, and wrote those contrasts into his work with a psychological precision that his contemporaries recognized immediately as something distinctive. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, published in 1886 AD, is the novel that Edinburgh produced from its own essential tension. Many readers and critics have recognized in its central image the respectable professional who contains within himself an uncontrollable, darker nature that no amount of respectability can permanently suppress. A specifically Edinburgh observation, drawn from the experience of a city where the respectable Georgian new town and the organic, dark old town existed side by side, each defining the other by contrast, each containing what the other preferred not to acknowledge. Stevenson himself wrote in an essay about Edinburgh that the city was always double, always split between its pretensions and its realities, between the Edinburgh it showed to visitors and the Edinburgh it kept in its closes. That observation, made in the 1870s, is still accurate today. Treasure Island in 1883 AD, kidnapped in 1886 AD, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 1886 AD. Stevenson produced three of the most enduring works of English-language fiction in a 3-year period, all of them shaped in ways traceable to the city that formed him. He spent most of his adult life travelling and eventually dying in Samoa. Driven from Edinburgh by the climate that wrecked his health, he never stopped writing about it. Arthur Conan Doyle was born in Edinburgh in 1859 AD and studied medicine at Edinburgh University, where he encountered a clinical teacher named Joseph Bell, whose extraordinary ability to deduce facts about patients from minute physical details, from their posture and their hands and their speech and their clothing, impressed him deeply enough to become eventually the model for Sherlock Holmes. Holmes is, in a precise and literal sense, an Edinburgh product. His method, the rigorous application of empirical observation to the detection of hidden truth, is the Edinburgh Medical School's intellectual tradition applied to crime rather than disease. James Clerk Maxwell, born in Edinburgh in 1831 AD, developed the theory of electromagnetism, whose equations Albert Einstein later described as the most important in the history of physics. Maxwell's work provided the theoretical foundation for radio, television, radar, and every wireless technology that has shaped modern life. He is less famous than he deserves to be, partly because the gap between his theoretical work and its practical applications was long enough to obscure the connection in popular memory. These three figures, Stevenson, Doyle, and Maxwell, are the human anchors for understanding Victorian Edinburgh's cultural and intellectual life. But they existed within a city that was navigating a much larger and more uncomfortable set of questions about the sources of its prosperity. In 1851 AD, the Great Exhibition opened in London's Hyde Park, and Scotland sent exhibits that accurately reflected its substantial role in the British Empire. But Edinburgh was not Glasgow. Glasgow, by 1851 AD, was one of the most powerful industrial cities in the world. Its shipyards were building vessels carrying British trade to every ocean. Its ironworks and engineering firms were producing machines that powered factories across the empire. Edinburgh had chosen a different path. Through the accumulated preferences of its property owners and professional classes, through its geography, which made certain kinds of heavy industry less natural than in Glasgow's River Valley, and through a civic culture that valued its Enlightenment legacy and its Georgian architecture. So Edinburgh developed industrially in ways that complemented, rather than replaced, its existing character. Printing and publishing became major Edinburgh industries, a natural extension of its centuries-long tradition of intellectual production. Brewing grew substantially, the geological composition of Edinburgh's water proving suited to certain styles of beer. Banking and finance continued to develop, with the Bank of Scotland and the Royal Bank of Scotland as major players in the financial infrastructure of the British economy, and medicine, with Edinburgh's medical school continuing to produce doctors who spread across the empire and across the English-speaking world. This is the point in the story where honesty requires acknowledging something that Edinburgh's Victorian self-presentation consistently preferred not to dwell on. Edinburgh benefited substantially and directly from the British Empire. The legal and financial and medical and educational institutions that made Edinburgh prosperous were not neutral instruments of universal progress. They were instruments through which an empire extracted wealth from colonized populations and administered the territories it had taken by force. Edinburgh-trained lawyers wrote the contracts governing colonial trade on terms that favoured British interests. Edinburgh-trained doctors kept colonial administrators and soldiers healthy enough to maintain the occupation. Edinburgh-trained engineers built the infrastructure that connected colonial economies to British markets rather than to each other. The wealth that flowed back into Edinburgh from these activities funded the new town's continued expansion. The city's cultural institutions, the professional lifestyles of its middle and upper classes. This is not a peripheral footnote to Edinburgh's Victorian history. It is woven through the centre of it. Some Edinburgh people were aware of this and troubled by it. The abolitionist movement had significant Edinburgh support. The Free Church of Scotland, which split from the established church in 1843 AD, when over 400 ministers walked out of the General Assembly rather than accept state interference in church appointments, carried a strong tradition of social reform thinking. But awareness of imperial morality was selective and inconsistent, as it was throughout Victorian Britain. Henry Littlejohn's report identified the Cowgate and its surrounding closes as the areas with the highest mortality rates in Edinburgh. The Cowgate, one of the main streets in Edinburgh's Old Town, running parallel to and below the Royal Mile, had been in the 15th and 16th centuries an address where wealthy citizens and foreign ambassadors chose to live. By 1860 AD, it was, according to Littlejohn's own documentation and contemporary accounts, one of the most overcrowded and physically deteriorated districts in urban Britain. He was not describing abstract poverty. He was describing addressable causes of preventable death. In specific buildings, on specific streets, with specific mechanisms that his report identified and that his successors eventually acted on. By 1900 AD, Edinburgh was a city of around 300,000 people, prosperous by the standards of Victorian Britain, more stable than Glasgow, more institutionally rich, more culturally confident, its university still world-class, its legal system still one of the most respected in Europe, its medical school still training doctors who went across the English-speaking world. Edinburgh, in 1900 AD, was a city that had learned to hold two truths at once: that it could produce work of extraordinary beauty and intellectual power, and that it could simultaneously sustain conditions of extraordinary cruelty for a significant portion of its own people. Both things were true of the same city at the same time. Edinburgh has never fully resolved that about itself. It probably never will. Chapter 11. 2 World Wars and a City that Survived by Being Overlooked. On the 4th of August, 1914 AD, Britain declared war on Germany. By the end of that day, recruiting offices across Edinburgh had queues of men stretching down the street and around the corner. The enthusiasm was genuine and it was complex. In 1914 AD, the British Empire was at the height of its reach and its confidence. Edinburgh was deeply embedded in that empire, economically, institutionally, and culturally. The men waiting to enlist did not believe they were walking toward the worst military catastrophe in British history. They believed they were doing what their city, their country, and their empire required of them, and they went willingly. Edinburgh's contribution to the First World War was enormous in proportion to its population. The Royal Scots, one of the oldest regiments in the British Army, mobilised multiple battalions when war was declared. Other Edinburgh men enlisted in other Scottish regiments. Edinburgh trained doctors staffed field hospitals, from Flanders to Gallipoli to Palestine. The losses were staggering. The National Records of Scotland holds letters sent home from the front by Scottish soldiers. Letters from men who had grown up in Edinburgh's tenements and Edinburgh's Newtown villas and Edinburgh's working-class neighbourhoods, and who were now living in conditions that their previous lives had given them no language to describe. The letters that survive tend to focus on small things: the state of the boots, the quality of the food, whether a particular friend is still in the same company, the mundane anchors of daily existence that become precious when daily existence is surrounded by violence. Many of the letters end with requests that are almost always the same. Look after things at home. Tell them I am well. The men who wrote those letters understood, in most cases, that neither of those statements was entirely true. The first day of the Battle of the Somme, July 1st, 1916 AD, produced nearly 60,000 British casualties. It was the worst single day in the history of the British Army. Families in every street in every part of Edinburgh received telegrams in the days and weeks that followed. The dead came from both sides of the social divide that the New Town and Old Town represented. New Town families lost sons who had gone as junior officers. Old Town and working-class families lost sons who had gone as private soldiers. The Western Front sorted its dead with a comprehensive impartiality that the city's peacetime geography had never managed. Edinburgh itself was not under serious direct military threat during most of the First World War. Its physical fabric survived intact. The war came to Edinburgh primarily in telegrams and hospital trains, and in the men who returned carrying wounds that were not always visible. There was one exception. On the night of the 2nd and 3rd of April, 1916 AD, German Zeppelin airships crossed the North Sea and dropped bombs on Edinburgh and the neighbouring port district of Leith. 13 people were killed. Several buildings were damaged. It was a minor attack by the terrible standards that 20th century air warfare would eventually establish. But it was the first time since the Cromwellian occupation, more than 2.5 centuries earlier, that hostile foreign force had brought violence directly to Edinburgh's streets. The realization that the sky offered no automatic protection was a genuine shock to a city that had not experienced direct attack in living memory. The First World War ended in November of 1918 AD. Edinburgh had survived physically, but the city that emerged was not the same city that had entered it. The Victorian and Edwardian confidence, the comfortable assumption that British civilization was progressing towards something better, and that Edinburgh's place within it was secure, had been damaged by 4 years of industrialized slaughter, in which the judgment of the leaders who had sent Edinburgh's young men to die was now a matter of open and legitimate public question. The Scottish National War Memorial, completed within Edinburgh Castle in 1927 AD, was designed not as a triumphal monument, but as a place of grief and commemoration. The names of Scotland's dead are recorded in a space designed to ask visitors to stand quietly and consider what was lost. It reflects a post-war mood fundamentally different from the recruitment enthusiasm of August 1914. The interwar period brought economic difficulty to Edinburgh, as it did to most of Britain. The empire that had funded Edinburgh's Victorian prosperity was showing the strain of maintaining itself. But Edinburgh in the 1920s and 1930s also had a cultural vitality that economic difficulty could not entirely suppress. Hugh MacDiarmid, whose real name was Christopher Murray Grieve, was the most significant Scottish poet of the 20th century. He was a committed Scottish nationalist, a committed communist, a relentless polemicist who made permanent enemies with an efficiency that suggested unusual dedication to the task, and a genuine poetic genius. His long poem, A Drunk Man, Looks at the Thistle, published in 1926 AD, is regarded by many literary scholars as one of the great works of 20th century poetry in any language. His arguments about Scottish cultural identity ran through Edinburgh's intellectual life like a current that would not stop. The Scottish nationalist movement was taking political shape in this period. The Scottish National Party was founded in 1934 AD. Its early years were characterized by internal division and electoral irrelevance. But the idea it represented, that Scotland should govern itself, was establishing itself in Scottish political culture in ways that would prove more durable than the party's early electoral performances suggested. Then, in September of 1939 AD, Britain declared war on Germany for the second time in 25 years. German strategic bombing of Britain during the Second World War aimed primarily at industrial targets, at ports and manufacturing centres whose destruction would materially damage British military capacity. London was bombed relentlessly during the Blitz of 1940 and 1941 AD. Coventry was devastated in a single night in November of 1940 AD. Glasgow and the neighbouring town of Clydebank were severely bombed in March of 1941 AD, with the Clydebank Blitz killing over 500 people in 2 nights and destroying most of the town's housing. Edinburgh was bombed, but not on this scale. It was further from German airfields than London or the industrial Midlands, which increased the operational difficulty of sustained attack. More significantly, Edinburgh was not Glasgow. It lacked the concentrated heavy industrial infrastructure that made Glasgow a strategic priority. Edinburgh's economy of law and finance and education and publishing and medicine was not the kind of economy that strategic bombing was designed to destroy. The total civilian death toll from air raids on Edinburgh during the Second World War was measured in dozens, not thousands. But Edinburgh's contribution to the war was not measured in bombs received. It was measured in people sent. The Scottish regiments that had gone to the Western Front in 1914 went again in 1939. The Royal Scots, the Black Watch, the Gordon Highlanders, the Cameron Highlanders, all suffered significant casualties across the campaigns of the Second World War, in theatres from Dunkirk to North Africa to Italy to Normandy to Burma. Among those who served were Edinburgh women as well as men. Scottish women served as nurses, as members of the auxiliary services, as drivers and administrators and intelligence workers in roles that the previous war had not systematically organised. A considerable number served in military hospital units that followed the Allied advance through North Africa and into Italy, working under fire, in ruins, with inadequate supplies, doing work that the advance required. They came home afterward and mostly did not speak at length about what they had seen. They returned to careers in nursing and midwifery and medicine and taught students who had no idea what their teachers had experienced. Edinburgh Castle served at various points during the war as a location for holding high-value prisoners. The most extraordinary of these was Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, who in May of 1941 AD flew alone from Germany to Scotland in a personal peace mission whose full motivations have never been entirely explained by historians. He parachuted out of his aircraft over Renfrewshire, was captured by a local farmer, and was held in Scotland before being transferred to England. The episode had the quality of a story that nobody in authority on either side quite knew what to do with, which is perhaps why it has never been entirely explained. The war ended in Europe in May of 1945 AD, and in the Pacific in August. Edinburgh had survived the Second Great War of the century by being, for once, not important enough to destroy. What it did with that survival would turn out to be one of the more unlikely stories in the history of any city. Chapter 12. Festival, Devolution, and the Return of a Parliament. In the summer of 1947 AD, a city still carrying the exhaustion of 6 years of war hosted an arts festival that nobody was entirely certain would succeed. The idea came primarily from Rudolf Bing, an Austrian-born opera impresario who had fled Nazi Germany in the 1930s and built his career in Britain. Bing worked with Harvey Wood of the British Council and with Edinburgh's Lord Provost, John Falconer, who provided the civic commitment and the financial backing that turned an idea into an event. Their shared conviction was that post-war Europe needed something that military victory and economic reconstruction alone could not provide. It needed beauty. It needed great art performed at the highest possible level. It needed a reason to remember that the civilization worth defending was worth defending not only as a political arrangement, but as a living, creative force. Edinburgh made sense as the location for several reasons. It had survived the war physically intact, in ways that most European cities had not. Its medieval and Georgian architecture provided a setting of extraordinary visual power. Its civic establishment was willing to take the financial and organizational risk, and it was far enough from London to have its own identity, rather than functioning simply as an extension of what London was already doing. The first Edinburgh International Festival opened in August of 1947 AD. The Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra played in the Usher Hall. Opera was performed in the King's Theatre. Scottish traditional music was woven into the programme alongside the international classical repertoire. Audiences came from across Britain and from a continent still in the early stages of rebuilding itself from rubble and loss. And then something happened that nobody had planned. 8 theatre companies that had not been invited to perform in the official festival decided to perform in Edinburgh anyway. They found church halls and small venues around the city and put on their shows regardless of whether the official programme had made space for them. They were not breaking any rule. The city's unlicensed venues were open to anyone who could pay the rent. The 8 companies performed. Audiences found them by word of mouth. The energy was different from the official programme, rougher and more various, and in many ways more exciting. The fringe had been born from an act of collective stubbornness. What grew from that beginning defies easy description. The Edinburgh Festival fringe expanded year by year and decade by decade, drawing more performers, more venues, more audiences, more international attention. By the early 21st century, it was bringing over 3,000 shows to Edinburgh every August, performed in venues ranging from purpose-built theatres to every kind of adaptable space a creative team could find and license. Attended by audiences totaling millions of tickets sold in a single month. Comedy that changed British popular culture was developed on fringe stages. Theatre that went on to define careers and influence theatrical practice internationally was tried out in Edinburgh church halls. The fringe has become, by most measures of scale and variety, the largest annual performing arts gathering in the world. The festival gave Edinburgh something that no other event had given it. A reason to exist on the world's cultural map that was entirely its own. Independent of London. Independent of the Empire. Independent of the constitutional arrangements that had defined Scotland's relationship with Britain since 1707 AD. But the political question that the Union had deferred, rather than resolved, was not going away. It was, in fact, gathering force. The post-war welfare state delivered real benefits to Scottish people. The National Health Service, public housing, expanded education. All of these were British projects that improved Scottish lives substantially. But they were administered from London, shaped primarily by English political priorities, and dependent on decisions made in Westminster by governments that Scotland's votes alone could not have produced. The discovery of North Sea oil in the late 1960s AD transformed the economic argument. Scotland was sitting above one of the most significant oil reserves in Europe. The revenue from that oil was being collected by the British Treasury and spent according to British government priorities. The Scottish National Party's argument that it was Scotland's oil and should benefit Scotland's people directly resonated in ways that purely constitutional arguments about parliamentary sovereignty had not. The Scottish National Party won its first Westminster seat in a by-election in 1970 AD. By the general election of October 1974 AD, the party held 11 Westminster seats and was receiving over 30% of the Scottish vote. Westminster responded with devolution proposals. A devolution referendum was held in March of 1979 AD. A majority of those who voted said yes to a Scottish Assembly, but the legislation had incorporated a threshold clause requiring that the yes vote represent at least 40% of the total eligible electorate, on a turnout of 64%. Even a majority yes vote could not mathematically reach that threshold. Scotland had voted yes. It was told that its yes was not sufficient. The political consequences were immediate and lasting. The Scottish National Party withdrew its support from the Callaghan government in a vote of no confidence in March of 1979 AD. The government fell by a single vote. The election that followed brought Margaret Thatcher to power. The Thatcher years are, in Scotland's collective political memory, a defining experience that shaped Scottish politics for decades after Thatcher herself had left office. The deindustrialization that her economic policies accelerated hit Scotland hard. Glasgow's shipbuilding industry effectively collapsed. Mining communities across the Scottish Central Belt were destroyed by pit closures. Unemployment in parts of Scotland reached levels that older residents compared to the 1930s. Edinburgh was somewhat insulated from the worst of this. The financial sector, the legal profession, the universities, the growing tourism economy built around the festival were not the primary targets of the economic restructuring, but the political consequences were felt in Edinburgh as acutely as anywhere in Scotland. The introduction of the community charge, universally known as the poll tax, in Scotland in 1989 AD, a full year before it was introduced in England, produced a Scotland-wide sense of grievance that crossed party lines and class lines with unusual thoroughness. The poll tax was experienced in Scotland not merely as an unfair tax, but as a demonstration that Scotland could be used as a testing ground for unpopular policies. That Scottish democratic preferences could be overridden by a Westminster government that Scotland had not voted for and did not support. In the general election of 1987 AD, the Conservative Party had won a large overall majority across the United Kingdom. In Scotland, it had won 10 seats out of 72. In 1989 AD, a cross-party Scottish Constitutional Convention was established, bringing together Labour, Liberal Democrat, and Civic Scotland organisations to develop detailed proposals for a Scottish Parliament. The convention worked for 8 years. When Labour won the general election of May 1997 AD under Tony Blair, with a majority large enough to implement almost any domestic policy it chose, the convention's work was ready. A referendum was held in September of 1997 AD. 74.3% of those voting said yes to a Scottish Parliament. 63% said yes to that Parliament having tax-varying powers. There was no 40% threshold this time. In May of 1999 AD, elections were held for the new Scottish Parliament. On the 1st of July 1999 AD, the Parliament was formally opened by Queen Elizabeth II at the General Assembly Hall on the Mound, the temporary home it would use while its permanent building was constructed at the foot of the Royal Mile. For the first time in 292 years, Scotland had its own Parliament sitting in Edinburgh. In the crowd outside the General Assembly Hall on that 1st of July, the reporters covering the opening spoke to people who had been politically active since the 1979 referendum and had spent 20 years waiting for this result. The Scotsman newspaper, whose archive preserves accounts from that day, described the crowd's mood as simultaneously celebratory and quietly disbelieving, as if many of those present were not entirely certain they were awake. An elderly woman who had attended the pro-devolution campaign events of 1979 was asked what she felt. She said she felt she had been waiting her whole adult life for this, and now was not entirely sure what to do with it. That combination of triumph and bewilderment is perhaps the most honest description of what that day felt like for many of the people who were there. The new Parliament needed a permanent building. A design competition was won by the Catalan architect Enric Miralles, whose proposal was unlike anything previously built in Scotland. Miralles described his concept in organic terms: a building growing from the land, drawing its forms from the Scottish landscape, from boats and leaves and the shapes of water. The resulting building provoked strong reactions in almost everyone who encountered it. From genuine admiration for a masterpiece of late 20th century architecture to bewilderment at a structure that seemed to resist every attempt to read it as a coherent whole. It also cost £414 million to build. The original estimate had been £40 million. The overrun, documented in meticulous and damaging detail by a public inquiry led by Lord Fraser of Carmilly, became one of the most politically costly episodes of the Parliament's early years. Miralles died of a brain tumour in July of 2000 AD, at 45 years of age. While the building was still under construction around him, it was completed and opened by the Queen in October of 2004 AD, at the foot of the Royal Mile, directly opposite the Palace of Holyrood House, at the opposite end from the castle that had watched over Edinburgh for 1,000 years. A Parliament should announce itself, Miralles had said. His building does. Chapter 13. Edinburgh Now, the city that refuses to be only one thing. On a September morning in 2014 AD, the people of Scotland went to polling stations across the country to answer a question that had been building, in various forms, for over 3 centuries. Should Scotland be an independent country? The result was 55.3% no and 44.7% yes. Scotland voted to remain part of the United Kingdom. The margin was clear enough to be definitive and close enough to ensure that the question would not simply go away. Edinburgh voted no, with roughly 59% against independence. The result reflected the city's particular complexity. The large professional class, with British-wide careers and financial exposure to UK markets. The university sector, with its UK research funding and substantial international student population. The financial services industry, whose risk calculations were not straightforward in any scenario involving a change of currency or regulatory framework. All of this sitting alongside a genuine and substantial current of nationalist sentiment that the yes vote represented, and that the campaign had made visible in ways that surprised many observers who thought they knew the city well. The referendum campaign transformed Scottish civic life in ways that went beyond the result. Turnout was 84.6%, the highest recorded in any election held in the United Kingdom since the introduction of universal suffrage. People who had never previously engaged with formal politics attended public meetings, read economic analyses, argued about questions of democratic legitimacy and national identity that most democracies are fortunate if they seriously engage with, once in a generation. Edinburgh, in the summer and early autumn of 2014, was a city having a sustained civic conversation of unusual seriousness and unusual breadth. Then, in June of 2016 AD, the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union. Scotland voted 62% to remain. Edinburgh voted approximately 74% to remain. The United Kingdom as a whole voted 51.9% to leave. The constitutional tension that Brexit created for Scotland was immediate and profound. One of the more prominent arguments made during the independence referendum had been that the safest way to guarantee Scotland's continued European Union membership was to vote no and remain within the United Kingdom. The Brexit result directly contradicted that argument. Scotland had voted decisively to remain in the European Union. It was being taken out by a United Kingdom vote, in which the scale of England's population meant that Scotland's strong preference could be outvoted, regardless of how overwhelming it was. The Scottish National Party government at Holyrood called for a second independence referendum. The Westminster government refused to authorise one. The argument over whether Scotland should have another vote became the dominant fault line of Scottish politics for the following decade. Unresolved and continuing, as this account is written in 2026 AD, Edinburgh, as the seat of the Scottish Parliament and Scotland's capital city, lives at the centre of this unresolved argument as a matter of daily institutional reality. The Parliament building at the foot of the Royal Mile houses a legislature of genuine power in the areas it controls and genuine limitation in the areas it does not. It can make decisions about healthcare and education and justice and housing policy that affect every person in Scotland directly. It cannot hold a referendum on its own future without the consent of the Parliament in Westminster. This is the constitutional reality of devolution. And it sits in the middle of Edinburgh's political landscape as a permanent source of both frustration and productive democratic energy, depending on how you look at it. But Edinburgh's story in the 21st century is not only, or even primarily, a story about constitutional politics. It is also a story about what the city has become physically, economically, culturally, and as a home for the people who actually live in it. Edinburgh, in 2026 AD, is a city of approximately 550,000 people. It is the second largest city in Scotland and one of the most visited cities in Europe. In August, when the International Festival and the Fringe are running simultaneously, the city's population effectively doubles for 4 weeks. The Old Town becomes so densely packed with visitors that residents of the closes and the streets nearest the Royal Mile sometimes find it genuinely difficult to move through their own neighbourhood at certain times of day. Tourism has been Edinburgh's greatest economic asset and has become one of its most pressing civic problems simultaneously. The growth of short-term holiday rentals removed tens of thousands of properties from Edinburgh's long-term rental market over the decade leading up to 2026 AD. The consequence was a housing affordability crisis of real severity in a city that had never been an inexpensive place to live. People working in Edinburgh's hospitals and schools and transport systems and shops found themselves unable to afford to rent in the city where they worked. Young people who had grown up in Edinburgh found that staying there as adults required income levels that most starting salaries did not provide. Edinburgh's City Council and the Scottish Parliament both introduced measures to address this. Licensing requirements for short-term rentals, occupancy limits, powers for councils to designate control zones in affected neighbourhoods. Whether these measures were sufficient to reverse a trend driven by powerful economic forces, as of 2026 AD, an open question. The city's economy in 2026 AD rested on several strong foundations. Financial services, built on institutions including the Bank of Scotland and the Royal Bank of Scotland, which had nearly collapsed in the financial crisis of 2008 AD and had required a massive government bailout before restructuring itself and eventually becoming part of the NatWest Group while maintaining significant Edinburgh operations, employed tens of thousands of people, and made Edinburgh one of the most significant financial centres in the United Kingdom outside London. Technology had become a significant Edinburgh industry, a genuine cluster of technology companies, from startups founded by University of Edinburgh graduates to established international firms that had chosen Edinburgh for their European operations, had grown substantially since the 1990s. The University of Edinburgh's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence research departments were among the strongest in Europe, producing both research of international significance and the graduate talent that fed directly into the city's technology economy. The University of Edinburgh itself, enrolling over 40,000 students and consistently ranked among the leading universities in the world, remained one of the city's most significant economic and cultural assets, maintaining the tradition of intellectual seriousness established in the Enlightenment period and never entirely abandoned. Life sciences and biomedical research had grown into one of the most significant research clusters in Europe. The Roslin Institute, located just outside Edinburgh, was where a team that included Ian Wilmot had created Dolly the sheep in 1996 AD, the first mammal successfully cloned from an adult somatic cell. Dolly changed the global conversation about genetic technology and about the ethical boundaries of what biological research should attempt. In doing so, it continued a tradition of Edinburgh-adjacent science, producing results that changed how human beings understood their relationship to the natural world. A tradition running from Hutton's deep time to Maxwell's electromagnetism to Dolly's existence. Edinburgh became the world's first UNESCO City of Literature in 2004 AD, a designation that recognized what was already demonstrably true, that Edinburgh's relationship with the written word was unusually deep and unusually sustained across centuries. The literary culture that Scott and Stevenson and Conan Doyle had established continued unbroken into the 21st century. Ian Rankin's Inspector Rebus novels, set in an Edinburgh of rain and institutional complexity and working-class streets that exist just outside the frame of the tourist city, had been translated into dozens of languages and introduced readers on every continent to a version of Edinburgh as real as the castle, even if it never appeared on the tourist brochures. The cultural life of the city beyond the festival months had grown richer than at any previous point in its history. The National Museum of Scotland, the Scottish National Gallery, and the Scottish National Portrait Gallery together formed one of the strongest concentrations of public cultural institutions available in any city of Edinburgh's size anywhere in the world. Think of a young person in their mid-20s, born in Edinburgh to a family that arrived from East Africa 2 decades earlier, working in technology in the new town, walking up the Royal Mile to the castle on a lunch break, because the view from up there is still the best thing available within walking distance. This is a person who has done this since childhood, who knows the history of the Edinburgh area, the way someone knows history. They grew up inside, rather than history they were taught. The Gododin, the castle, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the Parliament, the family's own story, which arrived in Edinburgh from a different direction than all of those, but which is no less part of what Edinburgh is. This person represents something Edinburgh has been from the beginning, a city of arrivals. The Mesolithic hunters who came north as the ice retreated, the traders from across the Roman-connected world, whose objects appear in Votadini territory, the Flemish merchants of David I's Burg, the French Huguenot refugees of the 17th century, the Highland families displaced by the clearances, the Irish families driven by famine, the South Asian and African and Eastern European and Chinese and Brazilian communities that have made Edinburgh their home across the last half-century. Edinburgh has never been ethnically or culturally homogeneous. The historical record contradicts the idea at every point. The city was diverse before that word carried its current political weight. It has been made, unmade, and remade by arrivals from every direction across its entire existence. The question Edinburgh faces in 2026 AD is the question it has always faced, though the specific forms change with each generation. Who is it for? What is it willing to preserve, and what is it willing to change? How does it balance the competing claims of its past and its future, of the people who have been here for generations, and the people who arrived last year, of the tourists who come to see what it was, and the residents who are making what it will be? Those questions do not have simple answers. They never have in Edinburgh. The rock is still there, the same volcanic plug that rose from the Lothian plain when the glaciers retreated 10,000 years ago, the same rock that Gododin warriors rode away from toward their deaths at Catraeth, the same rock that English and Scottish armies besieged and retook repeatedly across the long decades of the Wars of Independence, the same rock that Margaret of Wessex made her home, and that John Knox preached beneath, and that James Watt walked past on his way to conversations that helped start an industrial revolution, and that the Scottish Parliament now faces from the far end of the Royal Mile. 10,000 years of human presence in the Edinburgh area, 10,000 years of people arriving, building, losing, rebuilding, arguing, creating, surviving things that should not have been survivable, and continuing anyway. Edinburgh does not know exactly what it will be in the decades ahead. No city ever does. But if the evidence of 10,000 years means anything, it means this: whatever Edinburgh becomes, it will have earned it. It will have argued over it for longer than seems reasonable. It will have changed in ways that nobody predicted and preserved things that everyone expected to lose. And when you stand on that rock and look out over the city in some future year, the view will be different from what it is today. The way it has always been different from what it was before. And somehow, against all reasonable expectation, still Edinburgh. It always has been. It always will be.